What happens if your AI agents start making decisions without you even noticing? In today's session, we're looking at why governance isn't optional anymore and how the Microsoft 365 Admin Center can give you that missing control panel. You'll see the exact tools that help you keep your agents from going rogue while still empowering your teams to build what they need. If you've been wondering how to unlock the benefits of Copilot without losing oversight, you're in the right place. Why AI agents scare so many organizations? What makes a company hesitate when the benefits of AI agents seem so obvious on paper? Reduced manual work, faster decision-making, better use of data. On the surface, it sounds like a win that should be easy to sign off. Yet when the conversation moves from the slide deck to the real deployment, you see leadership teams start pulling back. The hesitation doesn't come from a lack of belief in the technology. It comes from fear of what might happen once hundreds or even thousands of small automations start running in the background without clear oversight. That tension between massive promise and equally massive uncertainty has kept many organizations stuck in pilot mode for much longer than they expected. The reality is that AI agents make people nervous because they don't run like other tools. You can control when employees install a new productivity app or block software with endpoint management, but agents don't sit neatly in those same boxes. They're designed to act, sometimes quickly, sometimes across multiple systems. Once released, they can feel like they're moving on their own. And for IT leaders trained to think in terms of control, standardization, and governance, the idea of invisible background processes shaping real information flows can feel like losing grip of the organization entirely. Plenty of examples show how this plays out. A research team launches a bot to pull and organize data sets. Someone else sees it working and copies it with minor tweaks. Within weeks, the company isn't running one well-governed agent. It's running 20 clones with small differences, no version control, and no clear owner. Now, an analyst in Berlin is making decisions of a data set slightly different from what a manager in New York is using, and finance is scratching its head because both versions end up feeding their reports. Multiply this by dozens of departments, each trying to speed themselves up, and suddenly the productivity boost has turned into a question of which number anyone can actually trust. We've also seen cases where automation crossed into territory that should never have been touched. One company had an internal script quietly moving customer information between systems to streamline onboarding, but no one reviewed whether the data transfers followed compliance standards. When the auditors arrived, the organization couldn't produce a record of who wrote it, why it was running, or what rules it followed. That wasn't a failure of AI's capabilities. That was a failure of oversight. A technology designed to save time introduced the largest compliance headache the company had faced in years. It's not hard to see why leaders react with caution. Introducing agents without boundaries is like handing every employee a drone and letting them fly it wherever they want. The first few may take off smoothly, but soon one crashes into a building, another disappears without anyone knowing where it went, and a third blocks an emergency helicopter from landing. Without a control tower, the very same technology that was supposed to add efficiency becomes a public hazard. The same principle applies in knowledge work. Automation itself isn't the source of fear. The absence of control is. Surveys back up what you can already guess from these stories. Executives consistently point to compliance, security, and data leakage as their central worries about enterprise AI. It's rarely about whether the technology delivers results. The worry is that the wrong piece of information escapes or that a bot takes action no one can track in hindsight. The stakes aren't just operational mistakes, they reach directly into reputation, regulatory risk, and customer trust. It takes years to rebuild confidence. When clients believe your automation exposed data, it shouldn't have. That's why it's important to name the real problem correctly. Companies aren't afraid of Copilot agents themselves. They're afraid of losing sight of them. They're afraid of forgetting who built which agent, when it was last reviewed, or why it's pulling information from sensitive systems. The problem is not the software, but the missing guardrails that keep it reliable, predictable, and aligned with organizational rules. Once you see it that way, the path forward becomes clearer. And this is where most people are surprised. The control board many organizations feel is missing is actually already inside Microsoft 365. It's not a separate add-on. It's not a hidden premium feature. It's baked into the admin center. And while many organizations use that portal only for license assignments or basic Teams policies, it has quietly become the air traffic control tower for Copilot agents. In other words, the guardrails you need are already sitting in front of you. The only question is whether you've opened the right panel. The control panel you didn't know you had. What if the cockpit for managing your AI agents was already sitting in front of you and most admins simply hadn't noticed? It sounds unlikely, but the truth is that the Microsoft 365 Admin Center quietly holds the steering wheel plenty of organizations have been looking for. The irony is that many IT teams open the portal daily but keep walking right past the parts that matter most for agent governance. When you think about it, this is one of those situations where familiarity almost works against you. You assume you know what's inside, so you don't expect to find new levers of control hidden behind tabs you usually ignore. For years, the admin center has been treated like a utility panel. You open it to hand out licenses, configure Exchange mailboxes, maybe adjust a Teams policy or two. It's the workhorse space to map features to users and make sure that people who raise tickets eventually get access to the services they request. What often gets overlooked is how much richer it's become. Behind that same interface lives a growing set of features designed to help admins manage not just who has access, but how people create, use, and share automation. If you've been worrying about Copilot agents spinning out of view, the guardrails for them are rarely more than a few clicks away. The mismatch is clear. Entire conversations in IT forums revolve around the fear of AI chaos, rogue bots appearing in departments, automations touching sensitive data, or workflows being duplicated with slight but damaging differences. Yet the same organizations voice these worries while barely glancing at the central dashboard designed to stop exactly that. It's a strange disconnect. We fear losing control, but underuse the very control panel that exists to coordinate the flights. That's like complaining about unpredictable traffic while ignoring the traffic lights on the corner. Picture a typical scenario inside a bigger company. Marketing has someone building agents to gather customer feedback, while operations is designing a bot to streamline order tracking. None of it is intentional shadow IT, it's enthusiastic employees trying to make their day easier. But when those agents launch, they disperse into different silos without a unified record. By the time IT stumbles across them, it's impossible to know who owns what or which data sources they're tapping. Suddenly, conversations with compliance turn into detective work. Who actually built this? When was it updated? Which permissions did it quietly inherit? Without clear oversight, even small automations can snowball into compliance gaps no one planned for. The admin center addresses this directly by pulling all that invisible activity into one place. Instead of guessing, you can view which agents exist, what connectors they rely on, and who has access to modify or publish them. Policies define which groups are allowed to create automation in the first place, meaning you can separate experimentation from formal deployment. This is crucial because building an internal prototype inside one team is very different from setting up something that impacts your entire CRM or HR platform. The center lets you keep those parts distinct. Permissions add another layer of safety. It's easy to imagine the risk if every enthusiastic employee could not only build agents, but push them live to the whole tenant. A better model is to allow broader participation in building ideas while limiting deployment authority to designated roles. In practice, this might look like finance analysts creating draft agents to shape their reporting needs, while only the IT governance team decides if those drafts ever make it to a production environment. By configuring these rules inside Admin Center, you decide in advance who sets the rules of the airspace. Reporting closes the loop. Instead of waiting until something breaks to realize a bot exists, you can track usage trends, see which departments are experimenting heavily, and build audits without chasing random spreadsheets. This data-driven view doesn't just cover compliance, it informs strategy. If you notice support teams are repeatedly spinning up similar agents, maybe it's time to invest in a standardized solution rather than let a dozen lookalikes run untended. The combination of visibility and control changes automation from a headache to an opportunity you can actually manage. So instead of imagining agents flying in every direction unchecked, picture the admin center as the air traffic control tower. Each flight plan is logged, every departure is cleared by policy, and collisions simply don't happen because someone can see the entire sky. Once you recognize that one central dashboard quietly holds this power, you stop treating agents as a lurking threat and start running them like structured operations. And with that framework in place, the conversation shifts. Because while admins get their oversight, employees still need space to build and experiment without breaking those boundaries. And that's exactly where Copilot Studio steps in. Innovation without chaos, Copilot Studio in action. How do you let employees create their own AI-powered solutions without dragging the organization into chaos? That's the central challenge when it comes to Copilot Studio. On the one hand, this tool is designed to unlock creativity across departments, giving people who understand their day-to-day pain points the chance to automate them directly. On the other hand, handing out building tools with no oversight could easily result in a wave of uncontrolled workflows that leave IT scrambling to figure out what's actually running. It's a balance that looks tricky at first sight. Do you empower users and risk the mess, or lock it all down and stifle the progress? Copilot Studio positions itself as the middle ground. Think of it as a workshop where employees can try out solutions, test interactions, and even publish agents to improve how they work. The difference between this and the DIY automations of the past is simple. Guardrails are already built into the platform. Instead of asking IT to play cleanup after the fact, Studio uses the same governance principles you manage in Admin Center and threads them directly into the design environment. That's what makes it practical rather than risky. Still, the tension for admins is very real. If you've ever seen what happens when enthusiastic staff get their hands on scripting tools, you'll know how quickly just testing can evolve into a mission-critical dependency. The problem is not ill intent. Most users just want to solve their own bottlenecks. But when those locally built solutions start interacting with customer data, financial records, or HR files, you quickly cross from helpful experiments into compliance territory. And once you're on that side of the fence, accountability and oversight aren't optional anymore. Picture this scenario. A finance analyst builds an agent that automatically pulls customer balances and generates a weekly report. It saves hours of manual work and becomes popular quickly. A few colleagues grab it for themselves, and soon it's spreading across the department. But here's the catch. Who ensured that the agent wasn't exposing sensitive fields? Who confirmed that the data sources matched compliance rules for handling financial information? And if a regulator comes knocking, who's going to prove that this was built and deployed according to policy rather than as a side project? Without the right structure in place, that simple bot becomes a liability. This is exactly where Copilot Studio strengthens the picture. The platform doesn't assume every builder is a professional developer. Its entire design includes protections for non-technical users. Admins define which actions are available, which connectors can be used, and who has permission to push anything into production. Employees may feel like they have full creative freedom, but what's actually happening is carefully bounded experimentation. That difference is what lets companies scale agent adoption without waking up to another shadow IT problem. The control points are specific. You might allow everyone in marketing to create draft agents, but only named individuals can publish them beyond a sandbox environment. Maybe only approved connectors like SharePoint or Dynamics are available, while anything touching sensitive third-party services is off-limits. On top of that, you decide which system actions remain restricted. For example, querying a database might be fine, but updating key fields directly is locked down to prevent accidental damage. In short, users can try out ideas, but they won't end up altering production records without explicit approval. A simple analogy helps. It's like a sandbox at a playground. Kids can build as many castles as they want inside the box, but there's a clear boundary around it. The fence makes sure the play stays safe, while still leaving plenty of room for creativity. Studio brings that same concept to agent building. Employees get the sense of freedom they need to innovate, while admins know the invisible fence is there to stop anything from expanding into real risks. So when you set Copilot Studio up with proper permissions and policies, it stops being a security headache and becomes what it was intended to be, a safe innovation lab. Departments can explore agents tailored to their work, experiment with new approaches, and share early ideas, all without breaking compliance or creating unsanctioned workflows. Innovation continues, but the chaos doesn't. And even with those protective walls, there's still one more safeguard you can't ignore: visibility. Because no matter how strong the guardrails, you still need to keep watch on what's happening in real time. That's where monitoring and tracking step in. The watchtower, monitoring and tracking agent activity. What if your agent quietly made hundreds of decisions you never saw? That's not a far-fetched scenario. It's exactly what can happen when an organization sets up controls but forgets the other half of the equation. Permissions and policies are like fences. They tell employees where they are allowed to build and what tools they can use. But without visibility, you have no way of knowing whether someone wandered into an unchecked corner or whether an agent is silently acting outside the scope it was meant for. Monitoring is the piece that shifts this whole governance story from guesswork to clarity. Think about how we usually deal with IT problems. Something breaks, a user submits a ticket, and then we scramble to trace back what changed. That's a reactive approach. It works in small doses, but becomes an expensive mess when scaled across hundreds of automations. With AI agents, the risk is bigger because the issue may be invisible until it's too late. A rogue workflow can run for weeks before anyone notices, not because it failed loudly, but because it quietly made decisions that all seemed valid on the surface. By the time someone asks why the data doesn't add up, you're investigating the past instead of preventing the future. Monitoring changes that rhythm entirely. Instead of working blind, you get live visibility into what agents exist, who built them, and how they're being used. Microsoft 365 bakes this visibility into its own ecosystem. Usage analytics help you see which departments are adopting agents quickly, which individuals are heavy builders, and where unexpected activity might start appearing. Audit logs track the details: when an agent was modified, which connectors it touched, and who triggered its actions. That kind of paper trail doesn't just make compliance happy, it's what lets you actually understand the living environment instead of guessing about it. The value of that insight shows up when you imagine a very ordinary scenario. A marketing team builds an agent to analyze customer feedback surveys. It starts small, one campaign, a few thousand entries, and the results look helpful. Over time, someone duplicates it for another project, then another team grabs the template and makes tweaks. Without monitoring, you've now got several versions of an agent running in parallel, each accessing data slightly differently. Left unseen, those differences eventually creep into reporting and confuse decision makers at higher levels. With monitoring switched on, you would see the spike in agent usage early, spot the growing duplication, and either standardize one official version or retire the extras before they turned misleading. Sometimes visibility is the difference between a minor correction and a headline-level incident. Take the case of an agent pulling sensitive financial data to speed up internal forecasts. If it accidentally exposed too much detail or made that data accessible beyond the finance department, the compliance risk would escalate fast. But with monitoring, the unusual access shows up clearly in the logs. You can shut it down or adjust permissions before regulators or customers ever have to ask questions. It's not about assuming the worst intentions from builders. It's about recognizing that even the most careful teams make mistakes when experimenting. Visibility is what makes those mistakes reversible instead of catastrophic. Reporting also smooths out the relationship with auditors. Anyone who's been through an audit knows the painful scramble to collect documentation, who approved what, when each change happened, whether controls were actually enforced. Manual tracking is error-prone and stressful. When your reporting system already keeps those records, you're not scrambling anymore. You can produce the history of agent activity in a format that aligns with regulatory expectations. That reduces both the human overhead and the risk that something critical gets overlooked. From an operational point of view, it also saves countless hours that would otherwise disappear into building one-off audit trails after the fact. What makes monitoring so powerful is how it reframes the whole responsibility. Instead of waiting for complaints as your signal, you develop a live map of what's happening. Trends become clear, surprises become less likely. You're not just enforcing rules with permissions, you're seeing whether those rules hold up in practice. It's the same difference as watching a city through live traffic cameras, instead of just trusting that signs at intersections are enough to keep order. One approach gives you confidence, the other leaves you nervously waiting for news of the next accident. So when you combine policy controls with monitoring, your governance model stops being passive and becomes truly proactive. Guesswork is replaced by oversight, and oversight is what prevents the silent buildup of risks that only surface months later. The watchtower view doesn't just protect against the worst-case scenarios, it creates confidence for teams to keep experimenting, knowing that someone is keeping an eye on the horizon. And that naturally leads into the next question. If visibility is so powerful, why do so many organizations still stumble into classic governance mistakes that undo those very protections? Avoiding the classic governance mistakes. The biggest governance failures with Copilot agents don't come from missing tools. They come from having the tools available and using them incorrectly. Most of the mistakes I've seen in organizations aren't because admins didn't know about the admin center or that Copilot Studio even existed. The real problem is that features were enabled without thinking through what kind of framework was needed to keep them working properly at scale. It's like giving every department their own set of keys to a shared office, but never agreeing on who locks the doors at night. A common pattern is that admins assume activation equals governance. A new feature shows up in the admin center, the switch is flipped on, and everyone feels like the job is done. But technology doesn't set the boundaries on its own. If permissions aren't clear, if monitoring isn't turned on, or if ownership is split between different teams without coordination, chaos creeps in quietly and steadily. The scariest part is that it doesn't typically blow up right away. It builds slowly, and then one audit, one incident, or one regulatory question suddenly exposes that what looked like control was actually a series of gaps waiting to be discovered. The first pitfall happens around permissions. If no one has defined who's allowed to build, publish, or share agents, users often fill the gap themselves. That can lead to duplication of agents being published into production before testing, or workflows that access data they shouldn't. Without sharp boundaries in place, you end up with a shadow catalog of automations that IT only finds out about when something breaks. Turning features on without trimming who gets access isn't enabling innovation, it's handing out blank checks. The second pitfall is skipping monitoring. More than once I've talked to admins who assumed that setting up permissions was enough, when in reality they had no insight into whether those rules were even working. That leaves them blind to what's happening. If you don't have audit logs turned on, you can't prove who did what. If you're not looking at usage metrics, you can't see which agents are catching on widely or whether activity patterns look unusual. Flying without that data feels fine for a while, until an external regulator or even your own compliance team asks questions you cannot answer. Inconsistent policies are the third landmine. One part of the organization might run a tight ship while another leaves publishing wide open. The inconsistency guarantees a messy mix of controlled and uncontrolled agents all living in the same tenant. From the outside, it can look like you solved strategy because policies exist somewhere. But compliance teams and security reviews don't just want proof that policies exist, they want proof that the policies are consistent across the whole organization. That variance becomes even harder to defend when different regions come under different regulations and your own policies don't line up with them. Then there's the classic case of siloed ownership. Maybe IT sets one rule, the security team assumes another layer of coverage, and business units assume they can publish as they please. Each group thinks someone else is watching the edges, but in practice, nobody is. That lack of clarity produces avoidable surprises like duplicate permissions or agents that slip through because it wasn't clear which team had final authority. One company I spoke with experienced exactly this. They allowed every employee to publish agents freely. At first, it seemed empowering. Everyone could experiment and push out improvements, but no one had connected publishing rights with audit logs. Months later, a regulator asked for proof of who deployed specific automations, and they had nothing. There was no track record, no owner of record, and no ability to defend themselves in the audit. What began as an effort to democratize automation ended up becoming a major compliance gap. These examples underline how small mistakes can quickly turn into large-scale risks. A misconfigured permission or an unchecked agent might look trivial in a small pilot, but at enterprise scale, that same oversight multiplies into hundreds of agents running in unknown corners. Problems don't scale linearly. They scale exponentially because every uncontrolled agent leaves open questions about data integrity, reliability, and security. The good news is that the traps are well known, and so are the ways around them. Start by defining baseline guardrails in Admin Center. Set clear roles for who can build versus who can publish. Make monitoring mandatory, not optional, so you're alerted before anything becomes a serious issue. Keep policies consistent even across regions so you can stand behind your governance framework with confidence. And most importantly, align with your security and compliance teams from day one. Leaving them out until later almost always backfires. Plenty of organizations have already shaped playbooks that work. Checklists for reviewing policies every quarter, policies that tie audit logging directly to publishing rights, and frameworks where innovation teams experiment first before IT reviews for formal rollout. Borrowing from these experiences means you don't need to repeat their mistakes. Every time another company has reported a failure, it's usually been because guardrails existed on paper but weren't applied in the right way. By internalizing their lessons early, you sidestep the costly fallout they had to endure. What this really shows is that governance isn't about slowing down teams, it's about making sure their efforts last beyond the first exciting prototype. The tools are already in your hands. The challenge lies in how you use them. And if you start seeing governance as an enabler rather than a barrier, it becomes far easier to encourage employees to innovate while knowing you've built a framework that won't collapse under scrutiny. Which brings us to the final point. Governance isn't just a safety net, it's the structure that makes sustainable growth with Copilot agents possible. Governance isn't the brake on innovation, it's the foundation that keeps innovation running once the excitement of the first prototypes fades. Without structure, agents turn into noise. With the right framework, they become long-term assets that scale safely across the organization. So here's the call to action. Stop guessing. Audit your current AI environment now. Switch on the key Admin Center controls that give you oversight before you expand further. That's how you avoid cleaning up later. And ask yourself this. If you had full visibility of every agent in your org today, what new possibilities would open tomorrow?